The courtroom was alive with a tense atmosphere as everyone waited for the trial to begin. The flickering lights overhead adding to the sense of anticipation. The walls were lined with people, some sitting quietly, others whispering amongst themselves, and the air was thick with tension like a storm about to break outside the heavy doors of the courthouse. A distant rumble of thunder echoed, as if the heavens themselves were aware of the storm brewing inside the courtroom, and in the center of it all stood the accused, a racist cop, with his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in a firm line, as if daring anyone to challenge him. His eyes scanned the room as he stood at the defendant's table, his posture stiff, his presence commanding, as if he believed his status would shield him from any consequences that might come his way. But in the eyes of everyone in the room was something different, a quiet sense of disbelief, as they tried to fathom how someone in his position could have done what he was accused of. The judge, who was seated high above them all, looked down with an unreadable expression, her face calm and composed. But those who had worked in this courtroom for years knew better. They could see the flicker of something darker behind her eyes, something that spoke of a deep well of emotion and experience that few others had the privilege of understanding. The cop seemed completely unaware of the gravity of the situation as he continued to stand with his arms crossed. He had no idea that the very woman who would decide his fate was sitting just a few feet away from him in that high chair above them all. She was the judge and the most powerful figure in the room, but to him she was just another figure behind the desk with the gavel ready to pass judgment. He wasn't concerned about her, he wasn't concerned about anything except for the fact that he had been accused of a crime he was sure he didn't commit. The whispers in the room began to fade as the bailiff stepped forward, calling the court to order, his voice steady and formal. He glanced at the judge, who gave a slight nod, and he turned to face the room in front of him. The room grew quiet as the judge finally spoke, her voice rich with authority echoing through the space. She began by reviewing the charges against the cop, her words methodical and clear. As the audience listened carefully, the details were damning, and yet the cop stood there, unmoving like a rock, in the middle of a flood, unaware of how the tide was slowly rising against him. He looked out across the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had gathered for this moment, the people who had come to watch him face justice. But among them was one face he would never forget, one face he didn't recognize, but would come to learn more than he could ever imagine. The young black girl who walked into the room and sat down at the defendant's table, her head held high though her hands were trembling. She had already experienced so much pain in her short life, yet she walked into this room with a strength that few could match. She had been called to the stand to testify against the cop. But as she sat there, the tension in the room grew even thicker. The cop didn't know her at all. He had no idea who she was. He hadn't even noticed the way she had been looking at him since she walked in. Her eyes locked onto his the moment she entered, and there was something about the intensity of her gaze that unsettled him. But he pushed it aside. He wasn't concerned with her. He had bigger problems than some girl sitting in the front row. He had a life to protect, a career to save. He wasn't going to let some accusation take him down. He was too powerful, too untouchable, too confident in his own ability to manipulate the system. And yet, as he stood there in that courtroom, he was completely unaware of the one thing that would undo him, the one thing he didn't see coming and would never expect. And that was when the judge, the woman sitting above them all, her face calm, her voice cold and measured, prepared to speak again as she called the court to order and began the proceedings for the trial ahead. The young girl sat at the defendant's table, her hands clenched in her lap, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to maintain composure. Her heart raced in her chest, but her face remained stoic, her eyes never leaving the cop who stood on the other side of the room, his back to her. As he stood proudly unaware of the truth that had just walked in the door, the girl took a deep breath and let it out slowly as she tried to calm the storm within her. She had been through so much in her life, so many things that had tried to break her, but none of them had succeeded. And today she would not let fear take control. Today she would not let the man who had caused her so much pain win. Her gaze never wavered from the cop as he laughed quietly to himself, like he had won some victory already. But she saw through him. She could see the cracks beneath the surface, the arrogance that covered up the fear that bubbled just beneath it. He had no idea who she was, no idea what was waiting for him, but she knew she had to be patient. She knew she had to wait for the right moment. The trial was proceeding slowly, each word from the prosecutor like a dagger thrown toward the cop's chest. But the man didn't flinch. He sat there smugly with a look of superiority in his eyes, as if he knew he was untouchable. And for a moment, the girl felt a wave of doubt wash over her. Could she do it? Could she expose him for what he truly was? But then she remembered her purpose. She remembered what had brought her here, what had pushed her to this point. And she knew she couldn't stop now. The prosecutor's voice rose in intensity as they presented evidence against the cop, each piece of testimony damning. But still the cop remained silent, his eyes locked onto the judge and his lawyer, his face unchanging. But the girl saw it, the way his hands shook slightly every time the prosecutor spoke, the way he kept glancing over at her, as if he could feel the weight of her gaze on him. But he had no idea how close he was to the truth, how close he was to his downfall. She could feel the energy in the room shift with every word spoken, the tension palpable like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. The cop continued to sit there, unmoving, acting as if he were above it all, but deep down she could see his confidence wavering. He could feel the pressure building with each passing moment. The girl's mother, the judge, sat quietly, her eyes never leaving the proceedings. She was a master at hiding her emotions, at keeping her thoughts and reactions under control. But the girl knew better. She could feel the fire burning behind her mother's calm exterior, and it was that fire that gave her strength. It was that fire that gave her the courage to sit in this courtroom and face the man who had done so much to destroy her life. Her mother had never told her about the cop, but the girl knew the truth. She had felt it in her bones. Long before the trial began, she had felt it the moment her mother had told her they were coming to court. The girl knew that her mother would be the one to judge the man who had caused her so much pain, and the thought of her mother's power gave her the strength to keep going, even when the room felt like it was closing in around her. Even when the pressure of the moment threatened to crush her spirit, she would not back down. She would not let this man win. She had to stand tall. She had to speak the truth. She had to make sure that everyone knew who he really was. And as the proceedings continued, she could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. The girl knew the truth. But she also knew that it wasn't just her truth. It was the truth of so many others who had been hurt by this man. His abuse, his cruelty had touched so many lives, and it was time for it to end. But as she sat there, her hands still trembling beneath the table, she knew she couldn't do it alone. She knew she needed her mother's help. And in that moment, her gaze met the judge's eyes for just a split second. But it was enough to send a chill down her spine. It was enough to make her realize that her mother knew too, that everything was about to change. The cop continued to sit there with his smug expression, as if he were untouched by the chaos unfolding around him. He glanced toward the prosecutor briefly, his eyes flicking over the evidence being presented, but his posture remained unchanged, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface of the table in front of him. But there was a slight nervousness in his eyes, a twitch that couldn't be hidden. No matter how hard he tried to keep up the facade, the girl noticed it immediately. The smallest sign that his confidence was beginning to crack. The prosecutor's voice rang out again as they presented a damning piece of evidence, a photograph of the cop caught in an act of violence during an arrest. And for the first time in the trial, the cop flinched, his body stiffening as the image was displayed for all to see. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, and the girl could feel her pulse quicken as the weight of what was happening settled over her. But still the cop tried to maintain his composure. His jaw tightened as he stared at the image on the screen, as if willing it to disappear, as if pretending it wasn't there could make it go away. But it didn't. The evidence was irrefutable, and yet he held on to his bravado like a shield, unwilling to admit guilt, unwilling to accept the consequences of his actions. The girl could see through him, though she could see the cracks appearing beneath the surface, and she felt a surge of strength building inside her. She had come this far, and she couldn't back down now. She couldn't let him get away with it. She had to stand her ground for herself and for everyone who had ever suffered at his hands. She had to make sure the truth was heard, and she knew the moment was coming soon. But as she sat there, her eyes never leaving the cop, she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something deeper. then the trial itself something that went beyond the evidence, and the testimony something she hadn't fully understood yet, but knew was coming. The girl's mother, the judge, remained silent, her face calm and stoic, but her eyes sharp as she watched every move the cop made. She had seen enough in her career to recognize the signs of a guilty man, and she knew the time was drawing near for the cop's carefully constructed world to come crashing down. It was just a matter of when, but the girl wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Each passing second felt like an eternity as she waited for the moment when everything would change, when the truth would finally be revealed. She could feel her breath catching in her chest as the prosecutor finished presenting their case, and the room fell silent. Once more, the judge leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting lightly on the gavel as she surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping over the cop, who was still trying to maintain his composure. The girl could feel her heart racing. Now the moment was so close, she could almost taste it. She could see her mother's calmness as a mask for something much fiercer, and she knew that when the time came, her mother would act with the full force of the law. But the girl couldn't help the worry that crept into her mind. Would it be enough? Would they be able to convict him? Would he get away with it? Would he be able to use his position and his power to escape the consequences of his actions? The weight of that question hung in the air like a cloud threatening to burst open and drown them all. But the girl shook her head. No, this man had to pay for what he had done. There was no other choice. She couldn't let him slip through the cracks, no matter how hard he tried to fight it. And as the prosecutor rested their case and the defense began to speak, the girl sat there watching him, listening to his every word. But her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what would come next. What would happen when it was all over? What kind of justice would be served? And would it be enough to make a difference in a world that seemed so broken? The cop's defense lawyer rose from his seat and adjusted his tie, his movements slow and deliberate as he began speaking, his voice smooth and confident, like he was trying to lull everyone into believing that his client was innocent, that all the evidence was circumstantial and nothing more than a misunderstanding. But the girl could see right through him. She had seen men like him before, the kind who used words as weapons to twist the truth, to manipulate reality, to make people doubt what they knew deep down. The defense lawyer's voice echoed through the room as he continued his argument, attempting to cast doubt on the testimony of the witnesses who had come forward. The girl's mind raced as she listened to him, trying to block out his words and focus on the one thing that mattered, the truth. But the lawyer's tactics were clever and manipulative as he painted the cop as a man under pressure, just trying to do his job in a dangerous world. He spoke of how the cop had been in a high-stress situation when the incident occurred, how he had acted out of instinct, how his actions had been misunderstood. But the girl knew better. She had seen the way the cop had acted on that day, the way he had targeted her and others like her for no reason other than the color of their skin. She knew his actions had been deliberate and cruel. But the defense lawyer's words were slick like oil slipping past the barriers she had built in her mind. He was good at what he did, and for a moment she felt a wave of doubt creeping in. Could she really convince everyone that this man was guilty? Could she prove that he was as bad as she knew he was? Could she make them see what he had done to her life? The cop's lawyer continued to speak, and she watched as the other people in the room seemed to hang on his every word. The prosecutor sat quietly listening, but the girl noticed how they shifted in their seat, a subtle sign that even they were becoming unsure, but that only fueled her determination. She had to fight harder. She couldn't let this man win. She couldn't let him walk away with a victory. She had seen the way he treated people, the way he had abused his power, the lives he had ruined, and the girl clenched her fists under the table, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. She wouldn't let him get away with it, no matter what it took. And as the defense lawyer finished his argument, he returned to his seat with a slight smirk on his face, as if he believed he had won. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the judge to speak, for the moment when the verdict would be delivered. But the girl's gaze never left the cop's face. She could see the way he held himself like he was untouchable, and she could feel the anger bubbling up inside her. It was so close now, everything was coming to a head, and she knew that this was her moment. The judge, the girl's mother, sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the cop with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. But still he didn't know the truth. He didn't know who was watching him, he didn't know who had been silently judging him from the moment he walked into this courtroom, but the girl did, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. As she waited for her mother to speak, the judge's hand moved slowly to the gavel, and in that moment the girl knew everything was about to change. And as her mother's voice finally broke the silence, it was clear that this moment would be one that the cop would never forget. As the judge spoke, her voice was calm and unwavering, but there was a subtle edge to it, a quiet power that rang in the air like the strike of a hammer on steel. And when she finally delivered her words, they cut through the tension like a blade. The cop's face drained of color as he realized the truth. The girl's mother had been watching him all along, and she had seen through his lies. She had seen everything he had done, and now the moment of reckoning had arrived. The judge's voice rang out clearly in the hushed courtroom, her words deliberate and measured as she addressed the cop for the first time directly. She spoke with an authority that shook the very air around them. Every eye in the room was on her, and the cop suddenly felt small, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. His confident facade began to crumble bit by bit, though he tried to mask it with a stiffened posture and a forced sneer. He could feel the sweat beginning to form on his brow and a knot tightening in his stomach. For the first time in years, he was no longer in control, and it terrified him. The girl watched from her seat, her eyes never leaving her mother. She knew what was happening. She could feel it too, the slow unfolding of justice, the weight of her mother's words sinking into the cop's mind like stones being dropped into a deep well. The cop shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the judge continued speaking, her words like a slow burning fire, methodically unraveling the lies he had built around himself. She spoke of his behavior, of the accusations against him, and she spoke with a cold precision that made his arrogance seem so misplaced. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she spoke of the slap, the one that had echoed through the courtroom earlier, and the pain that it had caused. She emphasized how his actions went far beyond misconduct and how they had left deep scars on the girl who sat quietly waiting for the moment of reckoning. The cop looked around the courtroom, his eyes darting from face to face, and for the first time he felt exposed, the weight of their stares pressing down on him. But it wasn't just the audience's gaze that held him there, it was something far more personal. It was the gaze of the woman he had never seen coming, the one sitting high above him, her power undeniable and her judgment irrevocable. The girl's mother had kept her composure until now, but the anger beneath her calm surface was evident, and as the cop realized just how deep his mistake had been, it hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. He was no longer in charge. This was no longer a trial where he could twist the facts. This was no longer a game of manipulation. He was facing something far greater than his badge, far greater than his pride. He was facing the full force of a mother's love and the crushing weight of justice. He could feel it now, that same justice that had haunted him in the back of his mind throughout the entire trial, now coming to the forefront as he tried to escape it. But there was no escape. He was caught in the storm of his own making, and no amount of power could shield him from the reckoning that was about to unfold. He had thought he was above the law, above the rules that governed the rest of society, but now he was realizing that no one was above the truth. No one could hide when their actions were exposed for the world to see. The judge's words came to a close, and there was a moment of eerie silence as everyone waited for the inevitable to unfold. The girl could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling, but she held herself still. She had come this far, and she would see it through to the end. She had waited too long for this moment, too many years of pain and suffering, too many nights spent in fear of this man's actions, and now it was all coming to an end. But it wasn't over yet. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room, and the sound reverberated in the girl's ears like the ringing of a bell signaling the finality of the moment. The cop was no longer in control. His fate had been sealed by the very person he had tried to deceive. The gavel struck again, and the room seemed to hold its breath as the judge prepared to speak her final words. She looked down at the cop with a cold expression, her gaze unwavering, but there was something in her eyes, something that made the cop's stomach churn. It was the understanding that he had just lost everything: his career, his dignity, his freedom. The girl could feel the heat rising in her chest. She could feel the power of the moment, the power of justice finally being served. And as the judge spoke her final sentence, the cop's world collapsed around him. The room seemed to close in on him as the truth was revealed, as the consequences of his actions became clear, and for the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to be held accountable for his choices. The cop's shoulders slumped as the judge delivered the final verdict, and in that moment, everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, came crashing down around him. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a ton of bricks, and he could feel the room around him spin as if he were caught in some terrible dream, one that he couldn't wake up from. The faces in the courtroom were a blur, but he could hear the faint whispers of disbelief echoing through the air as people began to process the reality of what had just happened. The girl sat in her seat, feeling the knot in her stomach loosen slightly, the tension in her body finally beginning to release. But there was no relief, no joy, just a sense of finality that had been a long time coming. She had waited so long for this moment, but now that it had arrived, she felt strangely numb, like she was standing on the edge of something enormous, something that had shifted the balance of everything she had known. She had seen the cop's arrogance up close, she had witnessed the cruelty he was capable of, and now she could finally see him broken in front of her, his pride shattered like glass falling to the floor in slow motion. The prosecutor moved toward the judge's bench to confer with her briefly, but the girl didn't watch them. She kept her eyes focused on the cop, who was still standing there trying to hold himself together, though it was clear that he had lost everything. His face was pale, and his lips pressed tightly together, as if he was struggling to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed him. They were wide with fear and disbelief, and as the room grew quieter, the girl couldn't help but feel a sense of justice rising within her, like a wave crashing against the shore. All those years of pain, all those moments of fear, had led to this moment, and though it was painful in its own way, she knew it was right. The judge's gavel struck once more, and the cop was escorted out of the room in silence, the weight of the decision hanging over him like a dark cloud. And as he was led away, the girl could feel her pulse quickening again. The relief wasn't there yet, it hadn't fully settled in her mind. She was still processing everything that had happened, and as the courtroom began to empty, she stood up and made her way to the door, her mother, the judge, watching her closely, but saying nothing. The girl's steps were slow and measured, but her heart was racing, her hands still trembling from the tension of the past few hours. She had done it, she had faced him, and she had helped bring him to justice. But there was something in her that still felt unsettled. The reality of it all hadn't quite sunk in yet. She had always known that what the cop did was wrong, that his actions were unforgivable, but standing there in the quiet of the courtroom, with the echoes of the gavel still ringing in her ears, she realized how much damage he had done to her, and so many others. He had ruined lives, destroyed trust, taken away any sense of safety, and now it was all over. But was it enough? Could anything truly make up for the years of hurt that he had caused? The girl walked slowly through the hallways of the courthouse, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She had won, but at what cost? The questions kept coming, the doubts swirling in her head. But as she stepped outside into the fresh air, she stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the city streets, and she felt the weight of everything lifting just a little bit as the wind brushed past her face. She looked up at the sky and felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. The cop was gone. He was being held accountable for his actions, but she knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The scars that he had left behind couldn't be erased by a verdict. No amount of justice could bring back the pieces of herself she had lost along the way. But as she stood there in that moment, she also knew that she had won. She had taken a stand, and she had fought for the truth, and that was something she would carry with her always. As the girl walked away from the courthouse, she could feel the weight of the day slowly lifting, but there was still a lingering heaviness in her chest, something that refused to let go no matter how much she tried to shake it off. The sounds of the city seemed distant, as if they were coming from another world. Her thoughts consumed by the events of the trial, she had finally confronted the man who had hurt her, but now she was left to grapple with what came next. What did it all mean for her? and for those who had been affected by his actions, the road to recovery wasn't going to be easy. She knew that much, but it was a road she would have to walk alone. The memories of what had happened in the courtroom kept replaying in her mind. The judge's gavel, the look in the cop's eyes as he realized that his world had fallen apart, and for a moment she couldn't help but wonder if that was enough. Had justice truly been served? Or was there something more she needed to do? She found herself walking through the park, her feet carrying her on autopilot, as her mind swirled with 1,000 questions. She had always told herself that she would be fine, that she would heal in time, the pain would eventually fade. But now she was unsure if it was that simple. The echoes of the trial still rang in her ears, and though she had spoken her truth, though she had seen the cop face his consequences, the girl felt a hollowness inside her, as if something had been left unsaid, something that she hadn't fully understood. Yet she took a seat on a bench near the fountain, the sound of water trickling softly in the background. As she let her head fall into her hands and closed her eyes, the anger that had driven her so far had begun to fade, leaving behind a quiet sadness, one that she hadn't expected. The fight had taken everything from her. The emotional toll of facing the cop and reliving the pain of his actions had drained her more than she realized. But as she sat there with the cool breeze brushing past her face, she realized that she had done something important, something that would have an impact not just on her own life, but on the lives of others who had been hurt by the same system that had protected the cop for so long. She had stood up to injustice, and she had won, and in that moment, she felt a sense of pride that slowly began to fill the emptiness inside her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her the strength to keep going. She had proven to herself that she was capable of standing tall, even in the face of fear and adversity. But the road ahead would still be difficult. She knew that healing wasn't an overnight process, and there was no quick fix to the years of damage that had been done to her by the cop and the system that had enabled him. But now she had a sense of purpose. She knew that she would continue to fight for what was right. She would continue to speak out for those who didn't have a voice, for those who had been silenced by fear and power. The girl stood up from the bench and took a deep breath. The sun was now setting, casting a warm orange glow across the sky, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope inside her. She wasn't broken, she wasn't defined by what had happened to her. She was more than the pain she had endured, and as she walked away from the park, she felt the strength returning to her steps. She had faced the worst and survived. Now it was time to move forward and build something new for herself, something that was hers and hers alone, something that would no longer be shaped by the cruelty of others. She could do this. She had proven it in that courtroom, and she would prove it every day from now on. The journey would be long, but it was one she was ready to take. The first steps had already been made, and with each step she took, she knew she was closer to finding the peace she had been searching for, the peace that only came when justice was finally served. The girl continued walking through the streets, the weight of her past still clinging to her shoulders. But with each step she felt a little lighter. The memories of the trial were beginning to fade into the background, and a new sense of clarity was beginning to emerge. She knew she couldn't change what had happened in the past, but she could shape the future. She was still standing, and she would not let the scars of her past define her. She passed by familiar buildings, the places where she had spent countless hours thinking about what could have been, what should have been. But now they felt different. They no longer held the same weight in her mind. They were just buildings, empty and hollow. And as she walked, her thoughts turned to the people who had stood by her, the ones who had supported her through the darkest moments of her life. They had been her anchor when everything felt like it was falling apart. They had reminded her that she wasn't alone, and though the journey had been difficult, she was grateful for them, because without their support she didn't know how she would have made it through. She made her way to the cafe she often visited and sat down at a table by the window. The familiar warmth of the place felt comforting, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe, to just exist in the moment, without worrying about what would come next. The waitress came over and smiled warmly at her. She had been coming to this cafe for years, and the woman had always recognized her. With a kind smile, the girl ordered a cup of tea and sat back in her chair, letting the steam rise from the mug. As she stared out the window at the busy street below, everything seemed so ordinary, so simple. as if the world had kept turning while she had been caught in the whirlwind of the trial and the events that had led up to it. But now she was seeing it all with new eyes. She could hear the sounds of people talking, the distant hum of traffic, the footsteps of people rushing by, but none of it seemed to matter anymore. She felt a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. She hadn't realized how much she had been carrying inside her until the weight began to lift. She was still here, she was still alive, and she was still capable of moving forward. The world was vast and full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to embrace them. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew it would be different. She had faced her fears, confronted the injustice that had haunted her for years, and now she could finally start to rebuild her life. She had taken the first steps, and though it hadn't been easy, she had done it with courage and resilience. She thought about the people who would benefit from her fight, those who would never have a voice of their own, those who were still struggling in silence to make sense of the cruelty they faced. She knew her journey wasn't over, it was just beginning, and there was still much work to be done. But she would do it with purpose and with strength, because she knew that the world needed people who were willing to stand up for what was right. She finished her tea and stood up from the table. The air outside was cooler now. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, she could feel the change in the air. A new chapter was about to begin, and she was ready for it. She walked out of the cafe with a renewed sense of purpose, with her head held high and her heart steady. She had faced the darkness and emerged from it stronger. She had become the person she had always wanted to be. And as she walked down the street, her footsteps seemed lighter, each one carrying her further away from the past and closer to the future. She was creating for herself a future that was filled with hope, possibility, and most importantly, the knowledge that she could survive anything life threw her way. The girl's journey had taken her far beyond the courtroom and beyond the walls of the city, where her battle for justice had been fought. The days that followed were filled with reflection and change. As she looked back at the events that had shaped her life, she found that she had learned more about herself than she had ever anticipated. The trial had opened her eyes to the depths of her own strength, her own resilience, and though the memories of that time still lingered in the back of her mind, they no longer controlled her, they no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her power, and that was something no one could take away. The world outside had begun to shift as well. The city felt different now, as if the very air had been cleansed by the storm that had passed through it. She had seen the people around her begin to change too, the way they looked at her, the way they treated her. They no longer saw her as just a victim of injustice, they saw her as a symbol of strength, someone who had stood up for herself and for those who couldn't speak for themselves. And as she moved through the city, she could feel the shift in the way people interacted with her. They no longer looked at her with pity or fear, they looked at her with respect and admiration, and it made her realize just how powerful the act of standing up for what was right could be. It wasn't just about confronting the cop, it wasn't just about winning in court, it was about reclaiming a sense of self-worth and dignity that had been stripped away by his actions and by the system that had allowed it to happen. She had done that, and in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. The girl found herself spending more time with the people who had supported her throughout her journey, the ones who had held her up when she felt like falling, the ones who had helped her heal from the wounds that had been inflicted on her. They had become her new family, the ones who understood her pain and her strength and who had stood by her through it all, and together they began to build something new, something stronger than the foundation she had once known. It was a slow process, but it was one that filled her with hope. As the days turned into weeks and then into months, she realized that she had finally come to a place of peace, not because the pain was gone, but because she had learned to live with it, to carry it with her without letting it control her. She had learned to move forward, and that was the greatest victory of all. She knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more struggles to face, but now she felt ready for them. She had learned that no matter how dark the road ahead might seem, there was always a way through it, always a way to overcome the obstacles in her path, because she had done it before. She had faced the darkness and emerged from it stronger, and she would continue to do so. With each new challenge, she knew she would face it with the same strength and courage that had carried her through the hardest moments of her life. She didn't need to carry the burden of the past with her anymore. It was part of her story, but it no longer defined her. She was free to create a new future for herself, and that was something that no one could take away from her. As she stood on the rooftop of her apartment building watching the city below her, she took a deep breath and smiled for the first time in a long time. It wasn't a smile of triumph or victory, it was a smile of peace, a smile of acceptance. She had made it through the storm, and now she could finally see the beauty in the world around her, the world she had once feared, but had now come to embrace, because she knew that she could survive anything, and that knowledge made her unstoppable. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a warrior, and as she looked out at the horizon, she knew that her story was far from over, it was only just beginning.